If this is your first time, we host monthly UX-related meetups, and for the past few months now, they've been completely virtual. Otherwise, in the past, we've held them in downtown San Francisco, where our office is. But yeah, for the time being, looks like we'll be in Zoom, but that hasn't changed anything. We've had some amazing virtual hackathons and some inspiring speakers like Cris. So with that said, do you want to take it from here?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I just realized we have the same name, but mine is the Spanish version, so
Yes.
without the H, right? Anyways, thank you everyone for coming today. I'll be speaking about what is a UX engineer. As you may know, I have an accent, so if there is anything you don't understand, feel free to stop me at any point. I'll try to make it conversational, the talk as much as I can, but there are 40 slides, there is a lot of content, and we don't have until tomorrow to go through all of this. So I'll try to make it conversational, but not as much as I wanted, okay? Um, I wanted to say again, like, thank you so much because, it's late, especially here in the East Coast. And if you're joining in Europe, Africa, or Asia, it would be like a different scenario, right? So thank you so much for making this. And yeah, let's start.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna start, wait, sorry guys. Yeah. So I'm gonna start with a little bit of background on how I became a UX engineer, and you're probably surprised about my journey. So I am from Spain. As I told you, I have a Spanish accent, as you can tell. And I was born there, I grew up there. And, when I started realizing that I wanted to study something, I didn't even know what to do. I was very passionate with computers. I always loved video games. And, I was very, very, very I would say like, um, I knew a lot of the new stuff, the new tech, cool shit that was happening at that moment. So that's the main reason why I started like thinking, what about if I study computer science and we will move from there, right? So I started studying computer science in Madrid, in the university, the Technical University of Madrid. And yeah, and that was like 15 years ago or something like that. Then I moved to Austria for a year, in the Vienna University of Technology, a very good university, by the way. And at that moment, I thought that I really enjoyed the path of cybersecurity. I had a couple of courses related with cybersecurity, and that was for me at that point, my main reason to continue with computer science and my main motivation. So you can tell how confused I was because right now I'm not even doing something close to that, right? So let's start now with a little bit of background in terms of working. While studying, in Madrid, I started working for a few companies. The very first one on the left, Dakar Tech, is a small company. Then I moved to Telefonica, which is a big corporation. You probably have heard about that. It's a big telecommunications company in Spain and it's everywhere. And then I moved to Oracle. When I moved to Oracle, during all these years, I was a backend engineer, right? I was doing mostly like software engineering stuff, not even close to front-end work. But at some point in Oracle, and I'm talking about this happened like 9 years ago, I had this project that no one wanted to take over, right? My manager told me, hey, you should take care of this because actually there is no software engineer in my team that wants to do it, so you should do it. So I said, why not? Let's give it a try. Let's see how it goes. And we tried to redesign an application. And as you can tell, these Oracle applications were very outdated. They look horrible. The look and feel was like very old. And, you could tell like users were very frustrated because the user experience was the worst, right? So for me, I started identifying that there was a lot of opportunity to actually do something good. And after working in this project, one of the things I really learned is that I really enjoy creating things that make sense from a user perspective. like at the end of the project, I got like thankful notes from users saying like the new application that we were building, you know, it was like a completely different you know, approach that it was took before, and they were like thanking us, you know, the approach that we're taking, because we were looking for ways to bring joy and things like that that never happened before. So we had the opportunity to do that, and after that, you know, I really felt like I was actually finding my path in my career, right? And that made me think, okay, what should be next, right? And we are talking about this happened 8 years ago, and I had the opportunity to move to San Francisco to work for a startup in San Francisco in the Bay Area called Hatchery. Hatchery is an incubator with other startups that are there. And what we do is, what we did was to actually work with these other startups to help them, providing them design resources, engineering resources to build things, right? To build their own ideas. And that's why I had the opportunity to work with many different companies. I share here four of them. You probably know about Creative Commons, is a nonprofit, but then the rest of them are startups. And you know, two of them, like Vessel, Invite, these guys are going crazy. Vessel got acquired. Invite now is getting a lot of very good momentum. Is in Series E, I think, and Brave Hands is also a great company too. I think it's in Series B, but yeah, things have grown quite a lot, and I had the opportunity to work in a very early stage with these startups. And most of my work was to do UX engineering, and that was the first time I was doing that as a full-time employee, right? I had the opportunity to work very close with designers, and at the same time trying to build things that the user wanted, right? So for me, it was a very a learning experience. It wasn't very easy because I had to learn as I was going, but was very fulfilling. And by the end of that year, and I'm talking now 2013, Google acquired part of the team in Hatchery. At that moment, they hired 6 of us, 5 designers and me as an engineer, and they wanted for us to create a new team, and not only a new team, like they wanted to for us to do things as we were doing in Hatchery, right? In such a way that we can collaborate very close with each other, you know, to break the waterfall process all together, you know, to be very lean in our process when working from end to end, right? And I was brought as a UI developer because that was the role at that time. And then after I think 1 or 2 years, we renamed it to UX Engineer. At that moment, when I was at Google, I had the opportunity to work for 3 different teams. One of them is Google for Work. Then I moved to material design. I worked in material design for 2 years, and then I worked for Google Maps and Search for the rest of that. It was a total time of, I think, around 6.5 years. And it was a great time. I learned a lot from very good, talented people. I think probably the best talent I've seen in my life. So I'm very thankful to that, but I decided to start my own company. And also I moved to New York recently, right? So I did this at the end of last year. And yeah, this is where I am. If you guys want to connect, I left the QR code right there. And you know, I'm more than happy to start connecting and messaging with you after this conversation that we're having today. So let's move on. So what is a UX engineer, right? Different companies name this role in a different way. You know, like Google says that UX engineers are these creative people, right, in between design and engineering. But then you have Amazon, and Amazon has its own way to call them, and is design technologist. I think Facebook got something similar. I actually don't like either term. I think that when you are doing this kind of work, you are not a designer, you are not an engineer, you are doing both. So I think it's not fair to say UX engineer, because where is the design term there? Not also the design technologist, because where the engineer team is, right? So the way that I like to call it is creative technologist. So that's how I call it. But big companies, usually guys follow the big companies, but at the end of the day, all of these names, all of these roles are the same. And as I said, we want to be in the intersection between design and engineering. And the goal for that, as you can see here, UX engineers, if you see the previous slide, design and engineering, these two areas are very big, right? Engineering, if we come back to this slide, we see that there is a front end. You can see there BE, which stands for backend. Then the one on the left, FE, which stands for front end. You can see like UX engineers are between the interaction designer and the front end suite, which is how we call it at Google. And these UX engineers usually try to do things in between and sometimes do things that are not supposed to, right? That's why you can see these circles colliding with each other, because sometimes what happens is at the end of the day, there is a lot of opportunity that needs to be done in other areas, and you start doing those. But the thing to keep in mind is that UX are the closest to design. So if we need to see what the UX engineer role is in between front end and interaction designer. What can we do in the middle, right? And the mission is very simple. You probably have seen this before in different memes, but what is happening today in a lot of companies is that we start planning with a beautiful plan. There is a beautiful design, but then something happens down the line that we get this, horrible force, But so this is what we want to be, right? This is where we see the opportunity to build something, that is pixel perfect, that makes sense, that the users enjoy using, right? So that is the mission of a UX engineer, to make sure that the end-to-end experience, is as beautiful as planned and is also feasible from an engineering perspective. So that's the mission of UX is, and that's what we were doing at Google. Just an example, and this is a showcase from some of the work that I did at Google, and we're talking about that this happened around 2014, 2015, the latest. When I came there, this was part of the Google Apps application. I don't know if you ever seen this before or if you remember, but it used to look like the screen on the left, right? Where there is a lot of things going on. Users are frustrated. They are calling support. Hey, I want to do this, but I can't because I'm not able to do that. So support team is like all over, in the phones just to make sure they were able to go from A to B, right? So it was a problem. As you know, Google has always been a first engineering-driven company, but it got to a point that we wanted to make it more design-friendly, right? And to care about design. And that's why Google started looking into this with a different perspective. When I joined Google, we were only around 10 UXs across the globe. Right now, there are more than 300. And as you can see on the right on this screen, things have changed quite a lot, right? You see like a much nicer menu, a nice car with the shadow, so it's elevated. It gives you this feeling of like you can interact with something that looks physical. And at the end of the day, we're accomplishing the same, but it's more beautiful, it's more engaging, right, from a user perspective.
Hey, Chris,
yeah.
Carlos has a question for us. He's just wondering, in this model, and maybe you can speak to it most clearly from the perspective of Google, is there a unified design team, or does each team go at UX and UI on their own?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. What happened at that time, and it still happens, there is always a core team that deals with design, and that was material design in 2014 when it got emerged. And what they try to do is build a foundation on how the components should look like, how the UX should look like, right? All the interactivity. So, and then all the teams trying to get influenced by them in such a way that they build how material design is supposed to work, So think about material design as a foundation design guidelines that we were using. They were also reviewing the work for every single team, but every team did it independently. I don't know if it makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? I feel I've been speaking a lot.
I was curious about the material. That's the design system. Did you actively contribute to the design system? Like, did you write documentation, components? Talk
Yeah.
more about that, maybe.
Yeah, definitely. So two things. Material design started in 2014. Around that time, I contributed with a couple of UI components, helping them, because at the end of the day, when we were doing this at Google, think about Google as a open source inside Google, right? So everyone can contribute, everyone can, share their inputs about things, but at the end of the day, the material design team is the one that will make the final decision in whether or not things will move forward one way or the other, right? Then around 2016, 2 years later, I joined material design. So I was part of the material design team, and we built what material 2.0 and what is material today, right? So that was my contribution in material design. But as I say, like at the end of the day, at Google, even though it looks like a huge company, everyone can have its own, way to do things, and it's very easy to share. It's very easy to innovate in a company like that. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Cool. Any other questions? Or should I move on? All right. So I think let's go to the next slide. So the impact of UX engineering. This is something that I cannot really share themes because I'm not supposed to do that. But I just want to share like some stuff, right, that will make you think twice about the impact of this kind of role. So the front-end development speed was increased. There were more releases than last year, almost 50% more. There were more components in production. And then the user retention of this team is in particular increased by 300%. We cannot really say that it really happened from a UX engineering perspective, but I'm sure that it was part of it. Another thing to keep in mind is that when I started at Google, as again, we were less than 10 people. Now there are over 300 people across the globe. So the impact has been quite huge, and it's something just to keep in mind. So now I think it's time to dive into UX, more or less like I want to share my own experience into how I think like how you can actually discover what your user wants and what is UX in general. And I'm gonna start with this, and this is it looks like a simple approach, but it's not that simple. So the idea is like always start with the end in mind, like what is a successful product, right? And when you think about what is a successful product, you always need to think about the user, right? You need to think about which is the problem that I am solving, because if there is no user, then the product, no one is going to use it, so you're going to fail, right? So you probably need to start considering what is the problem that you're trying to solve and who is that user, right? And that intersection of your solution, which is the product, and what you understand for the user, that is really what is happening, the problem, that is where UX, right, or what a successful product is, right? And that intersection brings these emotions right here, right? That you can see, like, how can you build credibility? How can you build trust, right? And that is usually happens from the look and feel, right? Then the look and feel, the interactivity, like, can the user enjoy the process? Can the user go from A to B, the usability, right? The functionality. So all of these parts are very important, right? Because not only from a functionality basis, also from an emotion basis, because as like humans are driven by emotion. So at the end of the day, you don't only need to create something that is functional and solve the problem. Also, you need to bring this other side of it, right? Otherwise, you could build something very functional, but at the end of the day, your competitor will take over, right? So that's something to keep in mind, because at the end of the day, again, like humans are driven by emotions. And one of the things that is super important, and a lot of you know, is like putting the user first always is the key. Like identifying the people who will use the final product, recognizing the goals that should be met for product success, and how can you create design solutions to, like, from something that could be very rough to something that is very completed, and then evaluating all the time, right? By testing prototypes, but seeing exactly if you are actually hitting what the user really wants you to hit, right? And for that, you know, like I have some suggestions here, like that I want to share as a UX engineer. It's very important to validate with your final product, even if it's not final. And what I mean by that is that you can validate from zero. You can validate without any tool, right? You can do paper, you can have a paper, you can have a pen and start drawing something and putting this in front of users, trying to figure out if you are actually solving the problem, you know, is key, right? Because that is going to tell you whether or not, you know, you're actually solving the problem that the users have, right? But you know that the risk of failure should be very high if you think that from a paper prototype, you have a successful idea, right? Because at the end of the day, you have to productionize it, and that's the most expensive stuff. So you better be closer to the final product. So a suggestion is to create different prototypes by fidelities as you go, and your ultimate goal should be the highest fidelity, right? Because the risk of failure, and what I mean by risk of failure is how far are you from getting what the user really wants, right? So the closer to final, the closer you'll be to get what the user wants, right? And a final recommendation is, as Albert Einstein said, like, there is no amount of experimentation can ever prove me right. A single experiment can prove me wrong, right? So you want to experiment, right? You want to try different experiments. You want to see what is happening there, right? You want to see things that you are doing wrong, things that you are right. But the idea is to fail fast, right? The more you fail, probably you will be closer to a successful product. And the idea is not only experiments, like the quality of experiments, right? If you create something that is super close to final or even is final, that will be better than if it's a paper prototype. And also the quality of user research, like, are you really understanding what the user wants? Because sometimes users, even if they tell you A is not A, right? You need to really understand what they want by, you know, approaching this in different ways, right? And again, like, I think the best way to do this is getting as close to final as you can. And then from there, you know, start grabbing the metrics that tell you whether or not you are in the right direction.
Chris, quick question before we proceed. Tristan asks, if you had to approximately break down what UX engineering consists of, what would it be? For instance, 30% front end, 20% UX, 10% UI. What do you feel, or can you even like put it in those silos?
That's a great question. I mean, I cannot really speak about every UX engineer, but from my experience, I've been like probably doing 50-50 depending on what I want. And I mean, I need to say that when I was at Google, I had the option to actually choose the path that I wanted. So sometimes I wanted to do more production work. So I was probably doing more front-end stuff than a UX engineer should do. But then there were some times that I wanted to invest more time into, you know, getting closer to the design team, work close with the user research team, being closer to the user. So it depends on you, but also depends on the company that you work for, right? At the end of the day, you could do both, especially if you are in a startup or a small company. But yeah, just understand that time is limited, right? So I think it's up to you and the company that you work. But from my experience, I was doing this 50-50.
Yeah, because what comes to mind for me, I know you're suggesting that on this graph, like your key contribution is at the end of this process. You're getting us the closest to the highest fidelity. and that's where we can get the best insights in terms of putting it in front of the user. But like, I guess the question that comes to mind based on Tristan's question is like, if you're at that point and you have an optimization that you feel should be made, what was your workflow even like? Were you going back to, say, the more traditional user experience designer asking their input, or were you taking that leap of faith on your own?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, when we are looking into this from a UX engineering perspective, you are probably not doing production work yet, right? So you are probably, I'll say, the UX design role you'll be hitting right now. So when you are doing that, one of the key aspects is how can you create a prototype that is fully functional, but in the quickest time possible, because you want to test that out as quick as you can, right? We're talking about we're running user studies maybe once or twice every 2 or 3 weeks, right? So we have to have like things close to final, but also, very quickly. And when you try to productionize things, or you want to try to get very fully functional as possible, that takes time, right? So that's why UX engineers usually are very, I'll say, like very talented and not talented. I'll say like we try to use different tools, different techniques to try to get us as closer as we can. Sometimes we have to fake it, and that is fine. But just keep in mind that at the end of the day, whatever you are doing, it needs to be feasible from an engineering standpoint, right? I've seen designers that they don't really understand the engineering aspect, and they try to go through different iterations over prototypes, and then at the end of the day, it's not feasible, so it doesn't really happen. And that's problematic, because at the end of the day, you are wasting all of this time, all of these resources, and you're going nowhere, right? So that's why I think it's very important to understand code, and I will go into that in a minute. But the idea is, if you can get close as final as possible, and what I mean close to final is, what is the engineering stack or the engineering framework that is going to build whatever you are trying to do? Because if you are prototyping using that framework already, that's going to make things much easier for an engineering team, right, to build it, because at the end of the day, you're using the same stack. But I know that not anyone can actually do it, and it's a lot of time, right? The closer to production, if you start coding, that's going to take you much longer than if you go to Sketch or Figma and put a quick prototype, right? But that's the trade-off, right? So we as UX engineers, the more and more work we do, we try to also have our own tooling system. Like I go to Figma, then from here I try to use this plugin or this other plugin, then I plug this into InVision or wherever. I don't know if you guys know Framer, but Framer is also was trying to bridge this gap as well, because it uses React from one side, and you can also do this sort of like prototyping by dragging and dropping components and things like that. I personally don't use Framer. I try to use it, but for me, I still do coding instead, because I think for me it's much faster, much easier to get into what I want to. But it depends on the requirements that you are getting from the design team, right?
Yeah. Looks like we have one other question from Autumn. As a UX engineer, especially when you find the design isn't feasible, do you get the final say on how the design should be, or does the final say go to the product designer or PM?
Yeah, so what usually happens is these meetings when we're talking about being at Google, we were very close to the product management team, and also with the designers. So when there were like new ideas or new stuff that wanted to be built, we were on these discussions from the beginning, right? And that's very important, because at the end of the day, even if we have a discussion and the designer does something else, but you are there close to the designer to understand more or less what is happening, or you can jump into the desk. I know it's not possible these days right now, because everything is working remotely, but I think it's very important, to be close to design, maybe like ask questions. Maybe the designer can also tell you what is happening, even though it's not the design is not final, right? But having this close collaboration with designers since the first minute is super important. So at the end, you can make the decisions on whether or not you should take that approach, right? If things are not feasible, you can tell that right from the beginning. If things are halfway feasible and you don't know, you can start doing the research while the designers are trying to make the design, right? So is this sort of approach where you can mitigate all of these issues in the beginning, and at the end of the day, it's gonna make things easier, right, for the process itself.
Makes sense.
Cool. Any other questions, Chris?
No, that's all for now.
Okay, awesome. If there are other questions, feel free to jump in and stop me at any point. Huh? All right. So I just shared all of this, and I wanted to put this quote right here because, well, first, I watched this movie last week, and I was in Europe. I know that this movie is not in the US, so if I'm not going to spoil the movie for you, but I highly recommend you watching that, especially if you like movies that make you think from the first minute to the end. It's a very good movie, but it's very hard to understand, right? And there is a quote in the movie that one of the actors say, "Hey, don't try to understand it, feel it." And it made me think, because at the end of the day, the same thing happens sometimes when you are trying to build something, and if you try to understand that very, very close to, okay, what are you trying to do, right? What are you trying to convey? The overthinking that is an issue, right? You need to feel it. You need to keep, you have to let your emotions speak out. So that's something that, by watching the movie, and also, by working sometimes with designers, I could see that sometimes it's even better to feel it and being able to bridge this gap sometimes where you think things are unfeasible, but all of a sudden you make something very creative that actually works very well from a user standpoint, right? And what I mean by feeling it is these emotions that you can spark, right? So I'd really recommend you to watch the movie, and let's move on. It was a little stop here, but I wanted to ask you guys, because at this point, I think I've been sharing a lot of stuff, but if we think about, again, if we want to make a successful product, and we try to see, okay, the fastest way to get there is to actually understand the user. I have a question for you. Who do you think is the faster learning creature in the world? Because if we identify that, then maybe we can identify the patterns of this creature and try to do similar things to understand the user, right? So I have this question for you. If anyone has an answer, please speak now. Who is the fastest learning creature in the world?
Autumn says a baby.
A baby. Oh, man.
Anita says babies, plural.
Good point. Yeah, a baby. Yeah, a baby, a kid.
Yeah.
I don't know how to put it, but kids, babies, whatever. Like these creatures are the faster learning creatures in the world. And if you look how they learn, they learn by interacting with every object, right? Like they interact with the environment, they break things, they experiment with things constantly. They don't overthink. And I think that's the key, to actually learn as fast as they do, and it's a very cool aspect, because if we look at them and try to identify the patterns, and we try to do the same, at the end of the day, we're being more creative, right? Because this is actually the secret of kids. At the end of the day, they are probably the most creative creatures in the world too. So that's something to keep in mind as well when we are, building stuff, trying to understand and learn with the user. If we experiment with the user, at the end of the day, we're gonna get closer to that. And the kids are actually showing us the way. So I will suggest you guys to try to bring your child, because the child is always there, so it's something to keep in mind when you're doing stuff, right? Try to make it playful. Try to bring your child, right? And it's probably you didn't even think about this, but this is something I always think when I'm making stuff, when I try to be in the creative side. At the end of the day, we should behave as kids sometimes to actually make very cool stuff, But anyways, now we're going to jump into something a little bit more serious. I'm going to share some case studies as a UX engineer. And again, like if there are any questions, please feel free to stop me, because this feels like a long conversation right now. So we're going to start with Google. And the main topic here is on the main problem that we wanted to do at this point was, how can we create tools to apply colors to any UI in a meaningful way to improve brands or styles? So let me give you some background. When I started in this project, and this was around, I think, like 3-4 years ago, Google has already launched material design, and it was used by many different companies like Airbnb, Lyft, Zappos. But we had a couple of issues there. One of the issues was to understand the color system, because we were actually trying to make the color system be more useful. It was very technical. There was a lot of content in the website itself. So for users were concerned about like the amount of information to learn about colors, and not only that, like we share with everyone, a set of palettes, but these were not really custom for brands, right? So if you had your own brand and you wanted to use our color system, you couldn't use it, right? So there were two questions that we wanted to solve here. Again, like, how can we create something more user-friendly that is easy to digest, to learn, and at the same time is, if your brand doesn't fall in this into this palette, right? How can you use the system, right? So the challenge was very obvious. How can we gamify the user experience? And then how can we enable brand customization? And this is a very tricky one, because brand customization means ensuring color quality for both perception and attractiveness, right? You need to make sure the users can read stuff, and also the colors should be attractive. And colors are very subjective, right? So how can we generate color palettes from a brand input color that are attractive, and at the same time, it can be perceived by any user, right? So that was a big challenge for us. And the process that we took, as I mentioned, was the UXC sort of like process, right? So we work very closely with researchers to validate our assumptions, making fully functional prototypes directly in code. And the reason why we did it was not to actually have, the closest to final, but also to see how the users were behaving with our solutions, right? Trying to understand, trying to let them think that they were using the final work, so we could see whether or not we were getting, into what they really wanted to have, right? So we experimented with in different rounds. Probably we did I think we did 4 rounds in 2 months. So that was the prototyping process, and all of them was built in code. We iterated again 3 times, and at the end we implemented the material design color tool. The implementation of this was just done in a month. So think about this, right? 2 months prototyping, 1 month implementing. Usually it's the other way around, right? But the reason why it only took a month, it was because it was built already in code, right? So we had to make it production ready from something that was already built. So it was very straightforward to actually implement the material design color tool. We also built the algorithm to generate palettes from any input colors. So the result, and the one that I'm sharing right now, and here you can check it out with the QR code, is the color tool. If you want to see the algorithm, you can go to material.io color, and you will find there the ability to actually generate colors from any single input color. So we created the first color tool at Google. There was an award for the year, the second best Google design project. Again, there was a patent, an algorithm and a patent for this tonal palette generation. And Matias Duarte mentioned this in Google I/O, that this was the start of a design system for making design systems, right? There was a big user engagement after that, an increase for also like new users. So just things to keep in mind, right? The next project I want to talk is Wigo, and this happened also like a couple of years ago. So we redesigned a consistent and fluid mobile application. And this, what you see right now here on the left side, is the final state of the application. Unfortunately, I cannot really show you how the app used to look like. I was trying to find it, but I wasn't really able to do so. But believe me, you know, the app, it was very old. It looked like an engineer actually created the design and everything. So I'm not gonna say that that's a bad thing, but you know, from a user experience, it wasn't ideal. And you know, this resulted in low app ratings and user drops and high uninstall rate. And that's why we started working with them to figure out what we can do to actually improve the current user experience, right? So the challenge was, well, there were three of them mainly. The first one was we had to create a native experience, but in a web application. They wanted to keep a web application for the current state of things, but we needed to make it natively, right? In a way that it feels that it's a native application. Then we had to do an end-to-end UI and UX redesign, as you can tell, and we needed to make it responsive for only mobile devices, right? For both phone and tablet. So the process, the way that we look at this was, okay, how can we redesign the whole thing, right? In such a way that you know, it's beautiful, it makes sense from a user perspective. So we introduced material design. And the way that we work with them was to actually focus on the UI component system while the engineering team was building the infrastructure, right? So we define a collaboration process with engineering for UI usability. So as we were like creating the UI components, we were also doing fully functional prototypes. But these fully functional prototypes, at the end of the day, were not final production work, right? Think about this as a way to actually validate our assumptions from a user experience perspective, but using fully functional, not fully functional, like using our UI components. So we were able to go to do different rounds of UX using the UI components that were supposed to be built afterwards. But at the end of the day, we're validating the user experience constantly with the users, while the engineering team was feeding the infrastructure using our UI components. It was very streamlined, and I will say that I will say that this process was successful because we were using the same framework stack. At the end of the day, what we were building, the engineers could just reuse it. So that's a big win, right? So the result of this, app ratings went from 3.2 to 4.1 stars. You know, navigation was fluid and consistent through the app. They share with us that the engineering team expedited the product development by 33%, which I guess it makes sense because we were doing also part of the work. We were building these UI components, right? And then they share with us like the development collaboration was very, very, very good. So that's something to keep in mind when we're like working with them and other teams, right? Like that's a very strong sentence, and you know, things to keep in mind for other projects that we took afterwards, right? The user retention grew. There were like less uninstall rates. We wanted less than that, but you know, I guess at least 3/4 of the people stay there, right? 3 out of 4. So yeah. So
Chris,
yeah,
quick with that one. Just, you know, one thing that strikes me about this one is you mentioned on the slide previous to this that you were porting in like the material design guidelines. And of course, with this, you're very close to that because you helped contribute to it. Like, how can we as like the third party make decisions to break here and there, like especially in this type of scenario? I know you're saying here you built a custom UI component system, so
Yeah.
inevitably there were some deviations from the standard material design, like especially you who are so close to it, like how can we have a framework for knowing where we can break things and where we should hold true to your guidelines from Google?
Definitely. I mean, the main reason of using material design, think about material design as the foundation of, so think about material design as the backbone, right, of the application. If you look at the application right here, which is the final version that we built, I don't know if you can notice, but it's built on top of material design. But we customize the components, right? Like these tiles that you are seeing right there, those were like custom for this specific application, right? But all of those use the foundation of material design. You could see like the cards, the different layers, right? Like the icons, we're using material UI icons. And at the end of the day, you know, we were working with the creative team, which was building the design, you know, and then making sure, you know, these UI components, you know, were ready for production work, right? So we were always considering the feasibility. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'm answering your question, Chris, but that's more or less how we leverage, right? Material design help us one step to get closer to the final UI componentry, but then we need to build on top of that, right?
Yeah, I mean, because the thing that strikes me is that over the years, the material guidelines have changed somewhat. There are elements that are updated. And I don't feel that we as the third party have like enough transparency on that process that maybe you enjoyed when you were at Google to know the why of the reason behind why things are changing. So
yeah, I mean,
yeah,
the main reason why kind of, yeah, I can speak about that.
Yeah.
So the main reason why Material 2.0 was released was to actually create UIs that look different than Google applications. So
Sure.
Material, I don't know if you remember, but Material 1.0 was very well known, and it was used across many different applications, but they all look the same.
Yeah.
And that was a big issue, right? Because at the end of the day, you don't want to look like Google. So that was the main reason why Material 2.0 was brought into place. And that's why we try to make things as custom as possible, you know, for different brands, right? Starting with the colors, then with the layout, how can we customize components? How can we make things that don't look like Google, right? So you can actually see it here because this app, I mean, you could tell like has some Google influence, especially in the bottom lab. But at the end of the day, you know, you could do many different things these days. And if you go to material.io, the new documentation, you see case studies, you can see how material can change from one application to the next. There are, I think, 6 or 7 different case studies. And you could tell like, it's very hard to know that they're using the same system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Any other questions? No? All right. So let's continue. So the last case study I want to share is that your user is not always your user. And you probably are like, what the heck are you telling me? They probably are like, I don't really get what you're saying here, right? But I'm going to jump into that in a second. And the reason why I'm putting this now is from what I'm about to tell you. So I cannot really speak about this startup in particular because it's a secret, but I'm going to talk about a specific implementation that we did. And that was like a complex UI interaction that worked seamlessly right across devices. This is not the final application, right? This is something that we saw it as an inspiration to build something very similar, right? And I'm not saying the business model, we were not creating a music application or like a movie app, but the feeling of like going from the main layout to the item itself, the animation, you know, like how things are like expanding, collapsing when you are scrolling down, how the header is collapsing with a really smooth and natural transition, right? All of that was the main inspiration to build what we wanted to build, right? So the main challenge for this was not only the creation of something that looks very similar, also that we were building this for a web application. And web applications, you may know, is a little bit harder to create these very smooth and natural transitions if you compare with native applications, right? So from a web app perspective, especially for performance, it was very tricky to think of creating something as close as that, right? It was a complex transition, and also we had to have some sort of responsive behavior into it. So things were getting very complicated. The process to build something like this, again, we started working very closely with the design team to achieve the intended UI interactivity. We built directly using the front-end framework stack. And the reason why we did it and we chose to do that was to make sure that if we were building something, it was feasible from an engineering perspective. You don't want to spend a month building something that is not going to get shipped or put it in front of user if there is no way to make it work, right? So that was part of the process. We developed also fully functional prototypes directly in code. And at the end, we implemented the backbone of the transitions and interactions. Again, we validated the feasibility constantly with the engineering team and the result. And this is where you're probably going to understand what I was meaning with your user is not always your user. And by the way, let me stop in a second. If you try to use the QR code, you're not going to see anything. It's a little joke. You know, I just did it because I think like since we had some other case studies, it should have also its own case study. And since we're having beers here and we're having some fun, there is some fun video right there, okay? So just keep that in mind. I don't know if anyone tried to put the phone right there and see what happened, but it's a fun video, you know, it's not the real deal. The reason why it's not the real deal is because it's still a secret. We cannot really share you know, the result of this, but your user is not your user because here our user wasn't the final user of the application, was the stakeholder and the design team and the front-end team to build it, right? We needed to get buy-in from every single team, and it was very quickly to get this buy-in because as soon as we put this in front of the stakeholder, he loved it, right? And then the engineering team, when we were able to actually make it feasible in a way that we were using the same framework stack, they were also in, right? So it was very easy to get everyone in the same place by creating something in code using the final framework, right? So again, very streamlined process from engineering, from development to production by using this approach. And Mike, the founder, he shared these words of like, to create a world-class product, you have to create these novel UI interactions. Our users love them, and that's exactly what we want. I don't know if the users will love them because we haven't put this in front of them, but we believe that what he's saying is true, right? But we still need to make those tests. Anyways, right now you're probably like, oh no, I don't know how to code. I don't know how to do this. This is very far from my knowledge and my experience. What I want to share with everyone is that anyone can do this. You know, there are tools out there, you know, that can get you as closer as final as you can. And my recommendation here is always to try to understand as much as you can the framework that the engineering team is going to use to build your experiences, right? Because at the end of the day, again, for feasibility, to make sure, you know, things go, the horse is built in the right way, right? You want to do this, but I know how hard it is to actually learn these languages if you never learned that before. So I'm going to share that there are tools out there that can get you there. And the first tools that I'm going to share with you are the ones that you already know, right? Starting from pen and paper, right? And then the wireframes with the Sketch, Figma, and you can go to low fidelity, then you can go to high fidelity using Adobe XD, InVision, Prototype, and you can create actually fully functional prototypes using Axure or Framer. I know that the more fully functional, the harder the curve is, and I have experienced that as well. So, you know, there are times that you probably want to take the risk to go from high fidelity to final production, but you need to keep in mind that the risk of failure to create this and to make sure that this is what the user wants, there is a risk there, right? And at the same time, we don't really know if it's feasible. So that is something to keep in mind always. And the last bit is, I don't know if you guys heard about the node code tools that are out there, but there are many out there that you can start using right now where you don't need to type a single line of code. And these tools that are right here, you can start using them to create not only fully functional prototypes, I'm talking about the final application, right? I mean, you probably cannot really create something as custom as you want, but you can create things that are functional and have some sort of, you know, some sort of like likeness, some sort of, you can create things that look good and feel good. There are tools like Webflow, for example, Squarespace, to drag and drop sort of applications where you can put things around very quickly. And then the combination of these applications is also very powerful. Like, I don't know if you heard about Airtable or AppSheet. These are like applications where you can actually have your database in a spreadsheet and then populate that using these other tools, right? Like Babel, Webflow. So at the end of the day, you can put together a database by dragging and dropping stuff and have your website by doing the same. So this is something to keep in mind. I think now there is a rise of no code tools. More people I started using them. I'll recommend you guys to give it a try. Again, my main recommendation is to always start with the code, but there are also ways to get you there, right? So if you haven't used it, give it a try, because there are very cool stuff out there. Some of books and articles that I want to share from my journey. The main ones are the ones that I'm exposing here. The Artist's Way, it's very good. It's also this spiritual path of creativities. It has a lot of different exercises that you can do to spark your own creativity. The Design of Everyday Things, that's a classic. You probably have seen it. Creativity Inc., a very inspiring book. How Pixar geniuses created stuff. The Pragmatic Programmer gives you this philosophy of how to program stuff, and not only that, it brings you new themes and new ways of thinking, as a programmer, and kind of philosophical. Don't Make Me Think, very useful for usability purposes to create things that, are very user-friendly. And then the Sprint Book, which is another way to do like design sprints, right? To make sure that you can build something in less than a week, starting from the problem and coming out with a prototype that you can put in front of users. Recommendations that I have there. Also, I want to share like something that you can actually find in your own website. The Future, I don't know if you know, but it's an incredible way to actually learn about UX in general. If you are a freelancer, I highly recommend you to take a look into this, because there is a lot of free content in YouTube. Also, there is a lot of podcasts related to this. There is a really good amount of information out there. They also have blog posts. I also use Medium a lot. I think the UX space is very big here too. And UX Magazine, I used to use it. I don't do it more anymore, but it was cool to use it in the past, and I think there is a lot of good content even these days. So I recommend it too, to give it a try, right? I don't know if you guys have or use any of those, or if you have read any of these books, but yeah. And the last thing I want to say is, here in Torre Studio, I share with you more or less our philosophy, the way that we want to create things that from an end-to-end perspective, right? And how we want to help design to go all the way forward to engineering in such a way that we can build this beautiful horse, right? That's that's our goal always as a UX engineers, and and that's the main reason why I started Story Studio. To think always with the user in mind and keeping things in such a way that are feasible. So that is sort of our analogy with the horse, right? Lastly, few things I want to share. Well, first, thank you so much for making through the whole presentation. We are now hiring different roles. If you are interested, or even if you want to give it a try to understand better what it is, feel free to reach out to me, to my email there on the bottom left. And, I really like to have conversations, at any time, any moment. So feel free to reach out. Also, we just launched in social media, in Instagram. So it would be great to if you can follow us, because we will be like providing content every week related to this space, right? The intersection of design technology, and also sharing like some of the projects that we were building right now, right? So all of this, and I think that now is time for some questions and answers. So yeah, uh, thank you guys.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions for Cristóbal? Autumn asks, what is the mid-late career track for UX engineer? Would this be something like a senior principal UX engineer to a VP of product, or how do you think about this? Or is it still too soon in this job title to know?
That's a very good question. And my answer to that, to be honest, I don't know. From what I know at Google, I haven't seen any VPs coming from a UX engineering background, but I just want to say that this is very early, right? 7 years ago, there were only 10 people. Now there are more than 300. So I think it's going to change. It's probably going to change in the next few years. But yeah, so my honest answer is like, I haven't seen any VP coming from a UX engineering background. What I have seen UX engineers is to grow, and sometimes even like get into a SWE role or to a design role, which is kind of sad. But I really believe that the future is going to change. It always changes, right? So I will bet that we'll see VPs in the future that will come from this role. Yeah.
Nice. Anita asks, when would you recommend creating a fully functional prototype versus a high fidelity? Like, when is it enough to just do something in Vision or Figma?
Very good question. I mean, the main reason to make something fully functional is to actually trick the user that is using the final application, right? So if you are, for example, I don't know, trying to deal with data, right? Like trying to make sure that, for example, the user needs to type something in an input and whatever, and depending on what it types, you do one thing or another, right? So if you want to create user flows with some specific user interaction, that's the time to create something fully functional, right? If you want to create something that deals with databases, as I said, it doesn't need to be a database. You can actually plug this in with Airtable and start making cool stuff and make updates to the database, reading the database, like populating a layout or whatever. So these are the things that, for example, are not possible right now with high fidelity tools. But if you use a fully functional approach, you can actually get there. So at the end, if you put this in front of users as a fully functional prototype that you can do in 1 or 2 weeks, you are getting feedback right away, right? Whether or not you are going in the right direction. So that's something to keep in mind, right? So yeah, I will say, so the short answer for that is anytime that you think that you're dealing with real data or with something more interactive or more, I will say like, if you need to make a flow differently from one state to the other, depending on what the user does, right? Typing something or clicking somewhere. Yeah, I don't know. Did I answer your question?
What do you think, Anita? She says yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Autumn asks again, what skills do you recommend to transition from a product designer role to a UX engineer?
Start coding, start looking into, you know, think about which framework you want to develop things. If you are more intrigued to do work for iPhones, start looking into Swift. If you're looking something more related to Android, go to Android, right? If you want to use something that works for everything, go for the web, right? The web has its trade-offs, as I mentioned, right? Like to create something that looks very native. It takes some time and some knowledge, but at the end, it pays off. I've seen also UX engineers coming from a design background and with no coding knowledge at all. So I will say, like, if you can get as closer as you can with fully functional, thinking about, okay, how can we create something that is functional enough, even though I don't know how to write a single line of code? You can use no-code tools right now, right? You can combine those. There are easy ways to understand how to use no-code tools, and I'll take a look in Medium. I will check it out there. And if you want to know more specific things, I can actually share with you personally, like some of the blogs or even channels that you can even follow in Slack related to this. So yeah, I mean, there are many ways to get you there. You just need to find the one that works the best for you.
Perfect. That's a good transition into Anita's next question. In your opinion, what is the future of no-code tools? Can freelancers, for instance, really rely on this to provide a full-fledged solution to their customers?
I think so. I mean, I think no-code tools are the future. The only problem I see with no-code tools is at the end, if you have a front end or an engineering team that is going to build something, the no-code tools probably is not the best approach, right? Because that's not going to be used for production purposes, right? There are ways to use no-code tools to extract the code, and you can do it in Webflow, things like that. But just make sure that if you are taking the approach of no-code tools and there is an engineering team behind the final production work of that, make sure that you can collaborate or engage in a way that they can reuse some of your stuff, right? Just if you want to make it streamlined, right? But something to keep in mind.
Okay. Yuri asks, UX engineer sounds a lot like a unicorn. What is the chance to get a job as a UX engineer versus a company hiring two people, a regular product designer and a traditional software engineer?
That's a tricky one. I actually don't know. And to be honest, like, if we need to think about what are the primary roles to be filled in any single company for product reasons, you need a designer and you need an engineer first. And you don't need a UX. Just let's be honest, right? You need to prioritize the two roles before than you do anything else. But if you want to go a step above than that, if you want to get to a higher quality of things, just think about the UXC in between, right? Because that is going to make things more streamlined. There are people out there that are unicorns. I've met many of them. I wouldn't say there are a lot, right? But there are many out there that do front-end work, and they are constantly looking into ways to make things that are user first, taking care of the user experience, working very closely with designers, right? So there are people out there that are actually doing this already without the UXD hat, right? But they're doing UXD work, right? So it depends on how passionate you are to actually do this. And yeah, if I guess the question was, I think I was speaking and I lost track of what the question was. Cris, can you repeat that again? I don't know if I answered it.
Yeah, what's the chances that a company today is looking to hire, say, two people for that role? Or I guess, are you seeing that they're looking to hire that one unicorn? And maybe what I'm hearing from your response is it somewhat has to do with, the stage of the company. Maybe larger organizations would hire this specialized role, but maybe younger orgs might actually hire the individual experts. What do you think?
At the end of the day, is how hard it's for you to find that person, right? So yeah, that person is hard to find. But if I have two options. One, a front-end engineer, very talented front-end engineer, but is not, it doesn't really care about UX at all. And then I have a UX engineer that can do both, and I'm a startup or whatever. Probably choose the second one, right? Because it could probably streamline things much more easily to create this beautiful horse that we're talking, right? Maybe it's not the best performance thing to do, because at the end of the day, the more specialist you are, you can take care of things in a much more deeper way. But I think it's very important to also understand that for small companies in general, you need to wear many hats, right? So if you have someone that can wear both hats in a very nice way, you probably want to stick into that role, right?
Yeah. Javier has a question. He's asking, how important is it to build the thing right, especially when you're first starting out? Maybe this has something to do with kind of like MVPs or proof of concepts. You talk a lot about the beautiful horse, but like, how important is it to just build it right perfectly that first time?
I mean, I guess like if you're a pre-seed startup, if you are just starting, you don't really need to create the most beautiful thing in the world, right? You can start by, okay, how can we create something that makes sense from a user perspective and is functional, and maybe create some beauty out of it. It doesn't need to be perfect. Nothing needs to be perfect. Nothing is perfect. Don't get me wrong, right? We don't need to be that perfectionist, because the more we try to perfectionize something, the longer things take, and at the end, nothing gets shipped, right? So, but answering your question, I think is very important, you know, to identify the user first, build something that makes sense, and maybe later on you can invest to create something much more beautiful, much more engaging, where you can bring other emotions, not just functionality, right? Like other things in place, right?
Sure. Jacob asks, from a UX engineering perspective, what is your preferred web framework? For instance, Vue, Angular, React, or just plain old HTML5?
Me personally, I prefer React. I'm using it a lot. I really like how React actually works with this idea of building UI components, and that has been always why React was different from other frameworks. This idea of componentizing stuff is very powerful, because at the end of the day, if you componentize something, it can be reused afterwards. And the framework is very strong, and I think it's very easy to understand once you know JavaScript, right? So for me, React is the way to go. I used Angular before. I jumped into React after things like once they moved from 1.0 to 2.0, because it was such a change. And at that time, I preferred to go through the approach that most people were actually taking. And the good thing about React is that a lot of companies uses React. So at the end of the day, we can create more streamlined processes, right? For these engineering teams, right? So that's something to keep in mind.
Makes sense. It looks like Alex is raising your hands. Alex, if you have a question, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, I was actually just going to comment on the unicorn question. I see that a lot. I'm kind of passively looking for work. I've been looking passively for a long time. And I'd like to remind everyone who is looking for work, everyone wants the unicorn. They're always looking for the most capable, most qualified, most skills, lowest cost person they can find on their team. So UX engineer is very much that flex player, that jack of all trades. It's going to be able to come in and do everything. Having that passion, trying to learn more, handle more variety of scope, you know, being able to develop and design is ideal, but getting your foot in a little bit and actually having that hunger to experiment and learn with things, in my personal opinion, that's what makes a good UXE. And that's just my 2 cents. Like, everyone's going to try and get away with a unicorn. So that's my thought on that.
Very good thought. And I cannot really, I mean, it's more or less how I think about this too. And at the end of the day, we also need to know that even though it looks like the ideal role, at the end of the day, we are all human beings. And this is a very generalist role, right? I don't see myself working without a designer, for example. I know that I can do design, but if you ask a UX engineer to do the design work, or just the, I would say the design work from my side, because I come from the engineering background, right? And I don't know if I said that before, but UX engineers can come from every single background. They can come from a design background, from an engineering background, even from a product background. So at the end of the day, depending on where you come from, things are going to be more tricky. I can design things, but again, like, I wouldn't feel very comfortable to be like world-class application by designing, by being the main designer, right? So I also need to know my limitations into this, right? That's one thing to keep in mind. There is always weaknesses, even though you could be a unicorn, right?
Yeah.
You have to fill those gaps with your team, right? That's the key, I guess, to create cool stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I have a quick question around this like team breakdown actually, and that's kind of around change management. I think internally at our organization, we've been trying to get more into actual high fidelity HTML prototypes, like on just a staging server that we can test out internally first. And one thing I'm finding is, how have you managed, especially at Google, the ability to need to chunk off a certain amount of work for the UX engineer to digest without them actually making assumptions about stuff that you've yet to hand off yet? Like, how does that actually happen such that you're not making assumptions about things that they haven't even given you to digest yet?
So I think as I mentioned before, it's super important to be close with your entire team. And
yeah.
And when I see UX engineers, they usually are the only ones of the team, right? I haven't seen a team of more than one UX engineer when we're building a product, right? Usually there are 2 or 3 designers working. I'm talking about Google, right? Other companies don't have those many resources, and then you have the engineering team, right? So working very closely with them, being that single person that, you know, can make the design work shine a little bit more, right, and make it feasible from an engineering perspective. I think it's very important. So in order for us to don't get into that failing trap, I think it's very important to be constantly working with them, like taking a look into what are the things that are happening, providing feedback from the first minute. I think that is the key, right? And that's why you are there, right? At the end of the day, most UX engineers that I know, they are sitting side by side with the design team, right? So it's very easy at the end of the day to jump into another, right? And building these relationships at the end is, I think, very important too, right?
Absolutely. Well, you've been talking a very long time, so we should probably wrap it up. But I have one last, I guess, final question from Autumn. And would you ever go back again to Google, or is it Tory for life?
I don't know. I mean, if you ask me now, Tory is for life, right? But that's a very good question. You know, I don't like to say never is never, or nothing is going to happen, because you never know how the future can evolve. But I may come back to Google, I may not. But right now, my future is Tory studio, and you know, I'm very excited and passionate to move forward and to get as far as we can.